So I want to take a look today, just to kind of recap where we've been. So we started a few weeks ago looking at the birth narrative of Jesus. And Trudy, you can bring up my slide because I have just a picture there to remind you of the manger scene, which is historically inaccurate in that photo, but it reminds us of who the characters are. And we wanted to start there and wonder, are there any pieces of evidence that suggest that Jesus was coming as a Prince of Peace? Right from the birth narrative. And we remember that almost everything about the birth narrative suggests that this guy came in complete humility. He was born the kid of two people who were not highly successful. They were regular folk, everyday people, probably extremely poor, who didn't have much hope for much of a future in the Roman Empire. They had to go to Bethlehem, which was a major journey for them. She was pregnant, 9 months pregnant, by the way, to travel a distance that would take several days for them to walk it. And somebody was kind enough to loan them a donkey because they couldn't afford their own ride themselves. And a donkey was a very humble animal. This was not somebody's war horse who heard good things about what this kid might be. This was not a Hummer. This was not a tank. This was a Volkswagen Beetle, the first time around, before they were really cool, right? A very humble car that they chose to take. And when they got there, these two regular, lowly kids, as they were making their way in the world, found that there was no room in the inn. And as I pointed out a couple weeks ago, that added insult to injury, because this was a culture that prided themselves on radical hospitality. And so just imagine what it would have been like. I mean, you and I would have easily given up space in our homes if we saw a 9-month pregnant woman. We would make room. We would give up our space so that they could be comfortable. Instead, they find themselves in a stinky, filthy barn. And as much as we might want to say that that was more private or whatever, the reality is this was an extremely unclean place. Nothing holy happens in that barn. Goes against all the codes of whatever you might imagine what holiness should look like. And that's the space, a humble space. Now, there are other scholars and there are other people you can read that will give you a little bit different picture, a little bit more of a warm, fuzzy picture, more like a Hallmark card or a Hallmark movie rendition of the picture to romanticize what that environment might have looked like. But what I want to suggest to you and why I choose to listen to other scholars and their interpretation of this is because I know who the original audience was for this birth narrative story. And frankly, it wasn't like us. It wasn't for us. Now, the story's for everybody, don't get me wrong, but it resonated more quickly, more powerfully with the original audience than it possibly could with us. Because you and I, by global standards, are not poor. And you and I, by global standards, are not powerless. You and I, by global standards, have both power and influence, even if you don't know it. So let me just point out some things about the original audience. They were dirt poor, like the majority of the people in the world are today. Very poor, like I hope I get a meal today, poor. And they didn't have much power, like the majority of the people in the world today. They didn't have a vote. They didn't have much influence because of their heredity. Their skin tone didn't give them much authority in the world either. I hope this doesn't ruin your Christmas, but I want to let you know that Jesus had brown skin. We're not sure how deep the brown was, but it was brown skin. And because of the color of his skin, in our own country at different times in our history, that would mean he would not be very welcome to immigrate into our country. He would be looked down upon. There would be prejudice against him. The people who were the original heroes of this story, the people who were poor, who were brown, who were powerless, when they heard that this gift from God started in a stinky cave, when they heard that the first people who heard about this were the lowest rung third shift shepherds who drew the short straw, that they were the ones who got the angels' choir. When they heard that wealthy people from afar came to visit, and in order for them to really, if we just go with the story a little bit, in order for them to really pay homage, they had to get off their camels, and they had to find out that he wasn't in a mansion, but that he was in a very humble, meager place. That made their hearts sing. You know why? Because they recognized that if that's how God chose to show up in Jesus, if God chose to come in that humble of a way, for the poorest of the poor, for the powerless of the powerless, then that's how God's going to do it today. And for them, and for the millions of people in the world, that meant that God really was with us. So as we moved forward last week, thank you, by the way, for letting me teach on video while I was at a family wedding. And we looked at a couple provocative statements that Jesus made, which continued to build on this idea of his MO being a Prince of Peace. Because some of the statements that he made, which have become very popularized with us, they've also lost their meaning. So we hear words like turn the other cheek, and we think, oh, that's just a statement of passivity, when really it's a statement of social change. It was a provocative statement to raise the stakes. It wasn't just a walk away from violence. It was a, no, let me be human to my oppressor. You want to oppress me, you're going to treat me as an equal when you do that. When we hear that statement, go the extra mile, that's a reference to Jesus' teaching. But it wasn't just be a nice person to help out a little bit more. That also was a subversive statement, even in a peaceful way, to say to the Roman soldiers who made you walk the first mile, I'm choosing to walk the second mile, and you're going to have to tell your commanding officer why I did. It brought equality to the equation where there was no equality. And when Jesus said, if you're asked to give your cloak off your back, give them your shirt as well. That also was a statement not of just radical generosity, but it was a statement of, if you're going to take that much, if you're going to have that kind of injustice MO about you, then here, take even more as a radical statement of, you have made me become naked in a cold world. Jesus was a person of peace, and yet at the same time, he was a radical change agent who was very careful with his words because he wanted to bring about a different way of being in a world which only knew how to operate in power constructs. And what his whole life was saying is there is a different way. And the way that is different, the way that is rooted in the presence of God, is one of peace, but also justice. That's why the prophet Micah, when he's echoing a conversation with God and wondering, what does God require of us? It's not about how often you go to church. It's not about how big your offering is, but it's simply to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. That changes the world. And so when we look at Jesus' death, which we need to do to appreciate his whole life, we're going to see some evidences of these same things. And by the way, you're going to hear some echoes from the birth story and the death story. In the death story, you have Jesus going into his final week of life. We call it the triumphal entry. We celebrate it in the Christian tradition on Palm Sunday. And this is when Jesus makes his entry, and they lay down palm branches and treat him like a king and all that. But he had transportation issues. Jesus was dirt poor. They relied on other people to put him up for the night. And often they camped out, he and the boys, and he had to prearrange his transportation. And when he did, for going into the city, he was very specific about it. He didn't choose a horse. He could have. Certainly, he knew some rich people that could have provided a horse, a war horse, in fact, but he didn't do that. He chose instead a donkey. And that could be a good sequel, The Return of the Donkey, or something like that. He chose the donkey because everybody who's cheering for him, even though they're trying to elevate him with all kinds of pageantry, saying, you are our king, the way he comes in is on a donkey. That had happened before, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And at that time, as well as this time, a statement of, I'm coming in peace. I'm not trying to be the warlord overthrower that you want me to be. As he went in to that week, later on in the week after he taught in the temple and caused some problems, there were some times, by the way, where he lost his cool. If you want to see Jesus losing his cool, go home and read Matthew 23. The whole chapter is Jesus losing his cool. And he blew the cork, man, on the religious leaders of his day and just played it straight. This is what I'm thinking about, what I'm seeing in you religious leaders. Jesus was Jewish. He didn't have a problem with Judaism whatsoever. He was bringing a new face, a freshness to Judaism, but the leaders of the Jewish faith at that time were highly corrupt. And they were greedy, self-oriented, self-centered, and they were treating people with great injustice. Well, he's there at the Passover season, which means you've got some estimates of 500,000 people rolling into Jerusalem. And so everybody who's wanting to celebrate the Passover in the traditional way, there's one thing that must be done when you're having a meal together, and that is cleanliness mattered. They didn't meet around tables like this. They met reclined. They wore open-toed sandals all the time. And Jerusalem was filled with all kinds of debris from camels and goats and whatever else might be around. So everybody's stepping in it all the time. And now you're bringing those feet, those treasure troves of excrement, into your dining room. And so they wanted to make sure that that was not part of the dining experience. And so you would hire a foot washer who would be non-Jewish, because no Jew would ever be caught washing such crud off people's feet. So it would be a foreigner, maybe a slave, probably a servant that you bought for the night. But either somebody forgot about it, or they couldn't afford to buy one for that evening. And nobody's doing anything about it. And you've probably seen the movie or heard the story. And so what does Jesus do? He chooses to take the matter into his own hand. And taking the form of a servant, even a slave, he wraps the towel around his waist and starts to serve his disciples. He does the lowest move. And again, original audience, when they hear this, they're like, what? Because what they would expect is a tongue lashing from Jesus. They would expect Jesus to lay into the disciples. Like, who dropped the ball? Are you serious? We're gonna do this holy meal with stinky feet? And maybe in the culture's view, it would be, who's on the lowest rung of the discipleship ladder? Call that guy out. You're the one who's going to be washing the feet tonight, buddy. But that's not what happened. Jesus chose a way of peace. He chose a way of humility. And he wiped all the gunk off of people's feet as a statement. Now, Peter didn't really want anything to do with this. He was actually disturbed and refused it for a moment until Jesus cleared it up with him that unless he allowed him to wash his feet, he would have no part of him. And then he recognized that he would decide to get along with Jesus in that way that he went. After Jesus was done washing the feet of the disciples, he made a very simple statement. He said, you know, if you love me and you call me your Lord, your master, your leader, your guide, then it's incumbent upon you to do what I've done. So as you've seen me love you in this way, so love one another and love other people by this humble approach. So the Jesus who has all the resources of God at his fingertips chooses the lowest of positions in this dinner. And by the way, people who were in that room who he was serving, you had one figure named Judas who was going to sell him out that very night so that he could be arrested. You had Peter who, following him into the journey of being arrested, was going to deny even knowing him. Jesus chose to break bread with these guys, chose to wash their feet. It's unheard of, isn't it? If you know you have somebody who's out to get you, the last thing you're thinking about is having dinner with them, let alone doing some act of great service. But again, this shows Jesus doing another way. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where he's waiting for the end of things to happen. It's an olive grove. A friend let him camp out there for the night. Judas knows where it is. Jesus can't sleep that night. He asked the disciples to stay up, but they ate too much turkey and they couldn't keep their eyes open, I guess. Actually, they couldn't understand what was about to happen. They thought things were going to turn around the next day. Jesus knew what was coming. He couldn't sleep. Just like some of you, I bet some of you, when you're in the pressure cooker, did any of you say that you can't sleep at night, or you wake up after an hour of sleep and then your mind is just going all night long and you can't get back to sleep, right? Thank you for acknowledging that. That's Jesus. He can't sleep because he knows he's going to be in trouble in a short order. And sure enough, he hears the soldiers come. After he's prayed, God, take this away from me. I don't want to do this, but your will be done. I'll go with it, but I really don't want to. And finally, he hears the soldiers come, and he sees Peter act out of fear. What does Peter do? He carries a sword, probably to show everybody that they can defend themselves, and perhaps they do defend themselves on occasion. We don't really know. And Peter whips out his sword and cuts off one of the soldiers' ears. At that point, you'd think, okay, is this the moment? Is this going to be an Olive Garden showdown? Not the restaurant, but you know what I mean. Is this thing about to get serious? And thinking, okay, we're finally going to see Jesus take the gloves off. But instead, Jesus tells Peter to put his sword away. And he says a powerful statement. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. Those who live in violence are going to experience violence, are going to die by violence. So Peter puts away his sword, and this soldier, who's freaking out, no doubt, not sure what's going on, but Jesus picks up the ear off the ground, and somehow, miraculously, the ear gets reattached to the guy's head. I wonder what that did to his trajectory. What happened to that guy who just had grace happen to him, even though he was there to arrest this Jesus? You know, there's some echoes of things happening with all of this that we see in the Christmas story. People who aren't supposed to be there, people who are insignificant, people who react wrong. I'm thinking of Joseph and Mary both. Their first reaction to this whole idea of Jesus being born is negative. It's like, I got a lot of questions and I don't like where this is going. On both accounts, both reacted in a way that we would expect people to react. And then with time, with the presence of God working, they came to peace. They came to resignation, that they were on board with whatever was going to happen, and it did. Well, so Jesus was arrested. He was tried illegally, first by the Jewish leadership. And depending on which gospel account you read, he was either completely silent or he was incredibly strategic with his words. And either with the silent or with his carefully crafted words, he wanted to make it clear that there was injustice being done. And in his silence and in his words, he didn't stoke it, he didn't poke the bear, he didn't make matters worse, but he did speak truth in ways that they had to deal with. I find that instructive for us. I'm probably the only one, but sometimes in those few moments where I lose control, I say things that I regret. And when I say things that I regret, it creates new problems for me down the road. Has anybody ever experienced that kind of thing before? All right, thank you, one person who was honest with me. Very good. Yeah, but Jesus models something different. He's very strategic in the way that he speaks truth to the power that is right there. So he's still the peacemaker, but he's not going to be treated as unequal in this environment. He's not going to make matters worse, but he's going to be truthful to the ones who have crossed the line with him and are treating him unjustly. He goes on to Pilate, who's the governor over that entire area, and it's a similar exchange, very well-crafted words, by the end of which Pilate decides to wash his hands of the whole thing and says to the Jewish leaders, well, if you want to kill him, fine, but I don't see any reason for it. This is on you if you want to do this. Now, a couple things about that. First of all, Pilate probably didn't give a rip about Jesus at all, might not have even known that he existed. Because the Roman government had crucified who knows how many hundreds, if not thousands of people who claimed to be the Messiah up to that point. It's not like Jesus was the only one. He might have been the fifth one that day, for all we know. We don't know. What we do know is that there are historical accounts where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these people who claimed to be Messiah were killed. So Pilate hears that there's another insurrectionist. He's just like, okay, take a number. You know, we're building the crosses as fast as we can. He doesn't really care. But now he's being pushed to make some kind of a judgment, because the Jewish authorities want to crucify a guy, and that right has been taken away from them. So it's interesting that Pilate, in the story that we have, Pilate is a part of the Jesus story, just like the Roman government was a part of the birth story. Jesus is born in Bethlehem not because of any other reason than a census was called by the Roman government to get them there. Later on, after the wise men are there, and the local Roman government, sort of the Pilate type, but it was a different leader at that time, he hears about this new king being born, and what does he want to do? He wants to kill him before he grows into a man. So all 2-year-olds and younger were killed in Bethlehem, as the story goes. So the Roman government has something to do with Jesus from the beginning, and has something to do with Jesus at the very end. Perhaps the most profound thing, though, happens while Jesus is hanging on the cross. It's a horrific way to die. Usually, it might take you 2 to 3 days to die. But they did something special for Jesus to really make the point and to cause him even more agony. They beat him beyond recognition. They whipped him more than they were supposed to before they made him carry his own cross to his own execution. That was unusual for its day. We're given that note for a purpose. Again, it's powerful to any audience, but to an audience who is poor and powerless, felt oppressed, felt abused, to find out that this one that had so much favor of God went through the same kinds of things, man, it just meant that they might matter too. That God would even look upon them when everyone and everything around them is saying, you don't matter much to anybody, especially God. But to see Jesus go through it, that in a weird way gave them solidarity. It resonated with them. In a weird way, made them feel important. But a couple crazy things happened on that cross. A couple crazy things were going through Jesus' mind as he's hanging there to die that show that he's still other-centered. He's still operating on a different system. He sees his own mother there, who, by the way, was also in the birth narrative if you weren't paying attention. So Mary's there again. She was there for his first breath. She's not going to miss his last breath. And while he's there, knowing he's the oldest son who's supposed to look after her, he says to his disciples who are with her, "This is your mother." Looks at his mom, "These are your sons." He's thinking of her. He's thinking of love. He wants to take care of her to the end. And then a famous statement that I'm sure you've heard. He looks at the Jewish leaders who got him there in the first place, who were responsible for his agony. And at that point, you'd think, knowing that Jesus knew what was going to be happening just a few days later when the resurrection thing would happen, he knows he's going to come back. He knows that he's not abandoned by God, even though he feels like it. It even says as much at the time. You would think at that moment he would give them what for, right? You'd think at that moment he would finally give them a piece of his mind, saying, "Hey, you better enjoy today because I know what's happening in 2 days, and you just better watch out." You could just imagine what we might want to say in retaliation for all the pain that they've caused. But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, he utters another subversive statement. He says out loud, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Our first glance at that, our natural response is that is like, wow, this guy is full of grace. What a graceful statement, asking God to forgive them for this atrocity that they've now carried out and almost fulfilled. What a man of grace, and that's true. But do you recognize the subversive nature of what he's saying? The ones who put him there are feeling like they are on top of the world. They are in total control. They're getting rid of this idiot once and for all. And when Jesus says out loud in his prayer, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," he is saying out loud, you're the clueless ones. You don't see the pain you're causing. You don't understand the ways of God. You've missed the point. So while he's saying, "Father, forgive," because that is the way of God, that is the way of grace, he's also leveling the playing field at the very end. It's an incredible, incredible statement to make. bigger than just grace. It is once again, with his last breath, speaking truth to injustice. Of course, the story ends, kind of, with what happens on Easter Sunday, when he comes back from the grave, and he's experienced in kind of weird ways by the disciples over a period of time, by many people actually, but he doesn't quite look the same, doesn't quite act the same. The rules of this life don't seem to apply the same in this resurrected experience. And at this point, you might expect Jesus to, once he's, in this kind of a state, and it sort of proves everything he's been talking about, is this the time where he's going to finally flex his muscle and come back to the disciples and say, all right, let's take it. Wait till they see me now, kind of a thing. Is that the MO? But it's not. He doesn't come back and give his disciples a tongue lashing for running away in times of fear. He doesn't tell his disciples to gather the forces and let's bear arms and let's take over this thing. But instead, it is just the mere fact that this guy who was beaten to a pulp and executed has come back, and he's renewed and clearly still loved and blessed by God. That alone gives great hope and confidence to the disciples, who know that the rest of their lives, they're never going to be on top of the world. They're never going to be the world leaders. They're probably going to be in prison. They're probably going to die. And yet the big joke is on those powerful people in their places of authority, because at the end of the day, they still don't know what they're doing, and they have not robbed them of what actually gives life. Because no matter what their circumstances would be, they knew that God was with them and for them. It gave them the ability to sing in prison cells. It gave them the capacity to suffer terribly for the love of God. And it changed the world. We speak eloquently and freely about the grace of God because they got it back then. So we have this interesting thing when we celebrate Christmas. We're not just celebrating the birth of a superhero that comes and is very different than us. Actually, we're celebrating the life who is actually very everyday, ordinary in so many ways, but a life in which God infused God's presence in such a powerful way that everybody who saw him do his thing said, surely he is the Son of God. And you and I, who claim to be followers of this Jesus, now we have an interesting invitation in front of us. On the face of it, we have some decisions to make about how we want to live our lives, because we are all in the pressure cooker at one point or another. Are we going to, in light of who Jesus was and saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, in light of that reality, are we going to choose behaviors that are destructive and hurtful and cause more problems? Or are we going to be on the side of grace? Are we going to be on the side of dignity? Are we going to lower ourselves to the worst case scenario, to the worst behavior, or are we going to rise above it? Be strategic, thoughtful about how we speak truth and life and grace and equality. Which one do we choose? I'll give you a clue. Well, that answer should be really easy for you. Be healthy and good or be destructive. That should not be a difficult question. But how to get there is. If all we leave after celebrating the beginning of Jesus is a new to-do list to try to achieve in 2020, of okay, I'm gonna try to be more respectful, I'm gonna try to be more graceful, loving, I think we're gonna miss it. Because it's not really what Jesus was calling us to do. Do you realize what the word Christian means? It literally means little Christ. Do you know what the word Christ means? It means anointed. We are the little anointed ones, following in Jesus' footsteps. The whole thing is on the anointed part. Jesus was who he was, not because he had a fantastic theology and figured out how to get the logic right. He was who he was because he walked deeply with God, that the Spirit of God resided deeply within him, and it bubbled out in everything he did. That's what we're invited to do. If you want more love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control in your life, which are the fruits of the Spirit, it's not going to happen because you read a self-help book on how to do all those things more. It's going to happen because you're walking deeply and you're feeding on the very source of those things, which then creates a fruit in our life that is all of those things. So here we are, almost Christmas, almost celebrating the birth of this Jesus, who was the Prince of Peace from the very beginning, who lived the Prince of Peace throughout his life, and even when he died, remained the Prince of Peace. And his life, his testimony, his miracles, everything is an invitation for us to follow. And I'm wondering if you're up for that, to dwell deeply in the love of God so much that the primary marker of your life are all those things that we have found to be true about God through Jesus. This is your invitation. Let's pray together. So I'd like you to take just a moment of quiet and sort out, is there anything that God is speaking to you today in particular? Anything from our time together today that is sticking with you? Just identify it. What do you sense being called to do with what is more or less glaring today? God, if nothing else is heard today, I pray that the fact that you love us fully, endlessly, that is our beginning and will be our destination. Your love is the beginning and the end. And it really is unconditional, it is for everybody, even those who don't feel like it's true. May we own that today. May we drink deeply of the fact that you love us and that you're with us. May we find our hurts healed. May we find our fears removed. May we find our low self-esteem replaced by a deep self-respect as those made in your image. May we trade our sorrow for joy. May you have your way with us today, God. May we truly be Christian people, motivated only by the love that we find within your heart, now residing in ours. Help us be the people you've called us to be. Help us be conduits of your Spirit, that the world would know that you are real, alive, and love. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. We have a postlude, so sit tight. We have one last song from Travis, and as he makes his way. If you got any feedback for us on today's service or any prayer concerns, anything like that, or any support, just put those in the tins so that you see on your tables, and we appreciate it very much. Travis, give us one more.